Hello Zero Books readers, it's me again, Douglas Lane. This is the first in a two-part series of videos about a problem facing the left. Namely, it will be about how we can avoid taking a cultural turn. We'll be taking an excerpt from Eliot Rosenstock's Zizek in the Clinic and excerpts from an essay by Slavoj Zizek that was recently published on RT's website. And we'll take a peek at a recent advertisement for Gillette razors, while we ask ourselves this question: can there be an anti-social justice warrior left?
Radical tradition.
On January 13th, the Gillette Razor Company released an advertisement in the guise of a public service announcement. On YouTube, the ad was titled, "We believe the best men can be, Gillette." And the message was simple. Men, as a group, need to stop harassing and abusing women, and, in general, stop being toxic. Now, given that this was merely an advertisement, perhaps this idea of toxic masculinity is not very important. Gillette might just be following the latest fad, trying to use the Me Too moment to sell some razors. Perhaps this term, toxic masculinity, is no more significant than the Macarena, or, to be a bit more fair, the 1980s ad for Angeli by Maybelline.
'Cause I'm a woman, Angeli. I can bring home the bacon, Angeli. Fry it up in a pan, Angeli. And never let you forget you're a man.
Give her Angeli, the 8-hour perfume for the 24-hour woman.
Well, actually, as Slavoj Zizek pointed out in his essay, Traditional Masculinity Toxic?, the American Psychological Association recently released new guidelines for psychologists that deployed this term and that was, overall, remarkably similar to the narration of the Gillette advertisement. In an essay summarizing the guidelines, the APA announced traditional masculinity is psychologically harmful. Socializing boys to suppress their emotions causes damage that echoes both inwardly and outwardly. The APA goes on to say that prior to the 60s, all psychology was the psychology of men, and that, quote, just as this old psychology left out women and people of color and conformed to gender role stereotypes, it also failed to take men's gendered experiences into account, end quote. Now, there are many ways to raise objections to the claims the APA makes in their summary. For instance, it is almost always a mistake to claim that all of a field of study, social group, or really anything has a particular character. Women were not completely excluded from psychological studies prior to 1960. Rather, there's a large body of work on the psychology of women that dates back to the 19th century. What is more interesting about the APA's report is how it includes a reference to second-wave feminism and why this inclusion of a political movement was necessary. In the 2010 Handbook of Gender Research in Psychology, Professor Alexandra Rutherford from the Psychology Department of York University noted that, quote, outlining the emergence and development of the psychology of women appears to be a straightforward task until one tries to define the historical object. Treated strictly as a body of research or an institutional subfield within psychology, the psychology of women becomes artificially divorced from its gendered context and political origins. In the past, the development of the field known as the psychology of women was a response to political and economic changes in society. The degree to which the field contributed or contributes to the emancipation of women is a question that is worth considering and debating. But let's put it aside. This division between politics and psychology, the differentiation between the two fields, needs to be underlined. The struggle for socialism is a struggle for human emancipation and self-mastery. The realm of medicine and psychology is inherently hierarchical and always involves limiting an individual's freedom due to its reliance on specialized knowledge, state power, and corporate bureaucratic administration. When the power of these institutions are marshaled to address the health of individuals and populations, the authority of organizations like the APA can be justified. However, the concept of health isn't fixed but always contested. The idea of what constitutes a healthy society or culture is even more, as they say, problematic or subjective. Cultures change, and the idea of what constitutes health changes as well. That said, there are times when a culture or society is polarized or split, when there is no clear consensus. In fact, in capitalist societies, this lack of consensus and the consequent cultural antagonisms that arise from it are the norm, which is why our institutions of power are also fractured and specialized. So for instance, there's clearly a big difference between demanding healthcare as a political demand or demanding psychological services as a political demand and trying to use psychological or healthcare services in the place of politics. Using psychological services to correct people's cultural assumptions or to redress a power imbalance in society is an authoritarian move, and one that clearly is founded on an idealist conception of politics.
They're turning my wife, Betty, against me.
In his 11 Theses on Feuerbach, Marx criticized his fellow young Hegelian this way, quote, Feuerbach consequently does not see that the religious sentiment is itself a social product, and that the abstract individual that he analyzes belongs in reality to a particular social form. The same could surely be said of the advertising writers responsible for this Gillette ad, and this critique can be aimed at the APA as well. In fact, this is nearly, but not quite, the critique Zizek makes of the APA in his essay for RT. The Slovenian psychoanalyst argues that the APA is attempting to impose a new normativity. He raises the specter of the Soviet Union and compares the APA to the Serbsky Institute in Moscow. He notes that whether or not given traits are, quote, toxic is always contextual. The ability to remain stoic and take risks is often commendable. One need only think of someone like Karen Silkwood or Oskar Schindler, to name two Hollywood hero examples, in order to understand how these traditionally masculine characteristics are often a social good.
No. He's looking at you, kid.
However, Zizek stumbles when he suggests that the APA's attempt to correct masculine culture is itself the result of a rising culture of corruption. Using his argument against the notion of toxic masculinity in order to defend his friend, Avital Ronell, was perhaps too deliciously tempting to resist. But when he argued that there was a new politically correct atmosphere where one joke made in bad taste can ruin your career, but ruthless careerism is considered normal, he made the same error he was attempting to correct. Namely, he reduced a social problem to the level of ideology and culture. In order to adequately critique the APA's guidelines, we'd have to examine how they are put into practice. They can't be understood in the abstract, nor can they be combated on the level of sentiment or attitude. If there is a serious problem with these guidelines, if there is a deleterious practical consequence of their implementation, we should be able to find particular material consequences in clinics and hospitals and within other institutions and organizations that use these guidelines in practice. Something like an advertisement for Gillette razors can't be taken as evidence of a political or social problem, and we can't build a serious, consequential, or emancipatory politics merely by objecting to various cultural expressions and attitudes. Further, we can't understand practical problems by examining attitudes and ideologies alone. In his book Zizek in the Clinic, Eliot Rosenstock describes the purpose of a fictional Zizekian psychoanalytic tradition in a way that exposes the difficulty with any psychological approach to politics. To paraphrase, the goal is to help move human beings toward a position that can withstand the emotional turmoil of the contemporary global capitalist order, while providing tools that can help the individual successfully endure contemporary existence. This is perhaps an entirely laudable goal for a psychologist or psychoanalyst, but it is not a radical political goal. To embrace it as a principle of politics means forever remaining at the level of reaction, and it means ultimately accepting the material terms of our lives even as we create Lacanian loop-de-loops and other entertaining coping mechanisms. The title of this video is, Can There Be an Anti-Social Justice Warrior Left? The answer is a definite no. This is not because we must instead embrace the tenets of political correctness. It isn't because the left has to accept this idea that there is such a thing as toxic masculinity, as the APA defines it. Rather, by opposing these injunctions and descriptions directly, by defining our politics as in opposition to the ideology or culture of pseudo-liberal modernity, we remain firmly within the culture war. By sticking to ideology critique, we ignore how it's really our material conditions, that is, the development of capitalist relations, that are ultimately responsible for these cultural expressions.
This is what Jürgen Habermas, arguably the greatest philosopher of the 20th century. And he said, in the thesis on Feuerbach, he got it right. All sensuous activity are material. So, therefore, he says, let's not simply limit our analysis to production, but let's look at human interaction. When we interact with each other, this is also a sensuous activity, right? So he creates peace between Sigmund Freud and Karl Marx. Many people try to do that.
A little further on in that lecture you just saw, Professor Ivan Zeleny pointed out that Marx's theses on Feuerbach were not published in Marx's lifetime. Marx chose not to publish them because he thought they could too easily be misread. His idea that sensuous practices were the material basis of reality was too vague. In later works, such as Capital, Marx went on to spell out precisely what sort of sensuous practices counted as material. He argued that economic relations at the level of production were foundational. When Habermas broke away from Marx's conception of materiality and replaced it with the idea of human relations in the abstract, when he made his cultural turn, he also moved away from critiquing capitalism and toward embracing the liberal state as he found it. And this underscores why there can't be an anti-social justice warrior left. When we take attitudes and cultural expressions to be at the center of our political project, we risk ignoring the real material basis of society and abdicate our responsibility to create radical, foundational change. Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.